So our next session this morning will be discussing malt barley. So Peter Watts is a managing director. Peter oversees the daily operations of the CMBTC. Oh, I'm sorry. And strategic planning, final oversight and budgeting member, relations, research initiatives, as well as communications and marketing. With 18 years of experience in the international agriculture sector, Peter brings skills in agribusiness, marketing, research, and strategic planning. Peter graduated with a Master of Arts degree in International Relations at Laval University. Please welcome Peter.
Thanks. Morning. Thanks. Morning, everyone. Oh, that's working. I have to update my bio. I think 18 years is it's a little longer than that now. It's a few years old. It's nice to be here. I'm going to talk today about malting barley. The title of the presentation is What Puts the Malt in Malting Barley. So I'll talk about the key criteria involved in selecting malting barley. So what's important for maltsters and grain companies when they take a look at a sample of malting barley that you submit. And so we'll go through each of the criteria individually. I don't normally give this presentation, so the slides that I put up on the screen will be almost as new to me as they are to you. But I would encourage you to ask questions as we're going through. If you have them, you don't have to say, stick up your hand. We can make this sort of a dialogue or a conversation. Maybe just a couple of introductory comments about malting barley, what's been going on the last couple of years. We've seen, when I started at the CMBTC in 2014, the following year in the spring of 2015 was the lowest seeded area for barley in Western Canada since forever, since the 60s or 50s, or I don't know how far back. So we reached a bottom. It was about 7 million acres or 7.1 million acres. But over the last 5 years, we've seen barley area gradually creep up in Western Canada. And obviously that's a reflection of better returns for you as producers. And that's been both in feed barley and malting barley. So it's been promising to see the growth. And then this past year, we had a really big crop, bigger yields than expected, but also a higher seeded area this year. So we had over 10 million tons of barley produced. That's the biggest barley crop in over 10 years, 10 or 12 years. So that's encouraging. And we've seen good demand for malting barley in the international market and good demand for Canadian malt. So that's been supporting the prices. So it's looking better, and I think in the coming year things are still looking relatively positive, both for malting barley and feed barley. If any of you have seen my presentation before, part of it, bear with me in this. So, does anybody recognize this beer? Some of you in the crowd recognize it. Kate recognizes it. She's seen this before. This is snow beer. It's a beer made in China. And the reason I put it up here is because it's the most widely produced beer in the world. There is more snow beer produced in the world than any other beer. More than Bud and Bud Light combined. There's 5 times as much snow beer produced as all the beer in Canada. Biggest beer in the world, never heard of it. And the reason we've never heard of it is because it's only, or most people have never heard of it, because it's only sold in China. It's a very inexpensive beer. And so it's been produced for the masses, and it's been very popular. I was in China a couple years ago. We drank a lot of snow beer. It's a very low alcohol. Hey, Rory. It's very low alcohol, and it doesn't have a lot of flavor. But the reason I'm telling you this is that China is the world's largest beer producer, and as a result, they need malting barley, and they like Canadian malting barley, and they buy a lot of it. In fact, 4 of the top 10 produced beers in the world are in China. If you look at the list there, you can see I can't even see it from here where I'm standing. Snow beer is number 1. Then Qingdao, I think, is number 2. So 2 top beers in the world, Snow and Qingdao. Then there's the recognizable ones that we know, Bud Light, Budweiser. There's a Brazilian beer called Skol. Chinese beer in 6th place, Yanjing. There's Heineken, another Brazilian beer, Brahma, and then a 4th Chinese beer, Harbin, and finally Coors Light. So those are top 10 most produced beers in the world. At least that was the case a couple years ago. So again, the point is China produces a lot of beer. A quarter of all the world's beer is produced in China, and they don't produce any of their own malting barley. So they have to import it all. They don't import any processed malt, so they import malting barley from Canada and Australia and France and Argentina. So it's our single biggest market. So here's where our malting barley goes, roughly, when we look at the big picture. From last year, we exported about 1.3 million tons of malting barley to China. The domestic malting industry in Canada, which is primarily composed of the 4 big malting companies, they're using the majority, but there are smaller maltsters and some craft maltsters emerging. They're using about 1 million to 1.1 million tons a year. Some of that's sold domestically as malt, some about 2/3 for export. I'll show you in a minute. The U.S., we export about 150,000 tons of malting barley to a year, roughly, between 100 and 150. That's been declining. And then Japan. We've seen a little bit of an uptick in demand from Japan for Canadian malting barley, although interestingly, that is not used primarily in beer production, but to make sochu, barley tea, and a little bit in what they call their 3rd category beers. So that's the majority, 95% of the Canadian malting barley is sold into these markets. Now, drilling down, when I said the domestic malting industry in Canada uses about 1 million tons of malting barley a year, where does that malting barley, where does that malt go? So they produce processed malt. About 1/3 of it, 35%, goes into the domestic brewing industry in Canada. Another 35 or so percent gets exported to the U.S. Japan is the 3rd largest user of Canadian malt, followed by Mexico and South Korea. And then there's a number of smaller markets after that. So why am I telling you all this? I'm trying to paint a picture of the marketplace for Canadian malting barley for a reason, because each marketplace has different quality requirements. And so finally, before we get into the actual quality requirements, this slide shows you, what we're showing here in this slide is malt usage in the U.S. by the craft sector versus the mainstream brewing industry. Now, we all have seen the growth in craft beer production in North America. It's been exponential over the last 10 years. So today, about 13% of U.S. beer production is craft beer. 13%. So let's just round it up. Let's say 15. 85% is still the macro beers that we think of, like Bud and Bud Light and Coors Light. But this slide is showing you which sectors are using the malt. And you can see that about 35 to 40% of all the processed malt in the U.S. is being used by the craft sector. And that's because they're not using adjuncts, they're inefficient. So this has been a real boon for Canadian malt exports. So we go back to this last slide, and you show you 35% of all Canadian malt exports go to the U.S. Big chunk of that is going to the craft brewing sector in the U.S. So that's been a really important marketplace for Canada. So again, the reason why I'm telling you all this to paint the picture is that we've got China, we've got the North American malting sector and the North American brewing industry, macro and craft. These are all different sectors. And each of these has different quality requirements. So this might be a little bit hard to see, so I'll just explain what you're looking at here. What I've tried to do with this slide is just show you the different quality requirements from those different market sectors. So the far left one is China. That's our biggest market for Canadian malting barley today. China likes higher protein content. They use a lot of adjunct like corn and rice when they're brewing, so they need the enzymes from the barley in order to convert starches to sugars, to break down those starches and convert the starches to sugars. So they want higher protein levels. So you can see here, they're looking for 11.5 to 13.5% protein, roughly. They would take a little bit lower if they had to. And if we go across, we look at the mainstream brewing industry in North America, they're looking for 11 to 13% protein roughly from their malting barley. And then if we look at the craft sector, they want lower protein. They would even go below 10, maybe 9.5 to 11.5%. So very different quality parameters with respect to protein in particular. If we drill down germination energy, that's the germination capacity, everybody wants that high, 95% or above. Then we start to get into the actual malt specs. So is the barley in the top line. Now we look at malt quality. Everybody wants high extract. In other words, they want sugars that will convert to alcohol. But with respect to enzymes and diastatic power in the malt, here you can see the differences again. China, high. They want high enzymes to compensate for the high quantity of adjunct they're putting in, high percentage of adjunct they're putting in to their beer. Corn and rice are adjuncts alongside barley malt to reduce costs. The mainstream brewing industry in North America, they sort of want medium enzymes. And the craft brewing industry wants low enzymes. So when we think about Canadian malting barley varieties, Metcalfe is a high protein, high enzyme variety. Copeland would sort of be a medium to low enzyme, lower protein variety. So the Metcalfe would be suitable for that Chinese and North American mainstream brewing industry, whereas Copeland would be a little bit more suited, say, for mainstream brewing in North America and the craft industry. Now, that's not entirely true. China buys enormous amounts of Copeland as well. They're using it, but that's just sort of a rough guideline. And then when we drill down into these quality characteristics, there's something called FAN, or free amino nitrogen. This feeds the yeast in the brewing process. And again, there's very different parameters for the different brewing sectors. The Chinese tend to want high FAN levels. Craft brewing industry wants low. North American mainstream brewing industry somewhere in between or a little bit on the higher side. So again, what I'm trying to explain is that we have very different marketplaces today for Canadian malting barley, and as a result, there's different quality requirements that the selectors are looking for. So your domestic malting companies are going to be looking for protein levels on the lower side, maybe 10 to 12%. We'll get into this more in a minute. Whereas the grain companies are going to be looking for something a little bit higher because most of that barley is going to China. So they're going to be looking for a minimum 11. They'll probably take up to 13.5% protein for the export market. Like I said, if there's any questions, just stick up your hand or comments anytime. Okay, so let's talk specifically about the selection criteria when you are offering your barley to a malting company or Canadian to a grain company. Let's look at the selection criteria and what they're going to be looking at in your samples. First of all, moisture. Moisture range that the selectors are looking for is going to be in that 10 to 13.5% range. So 13.5% tends to be the maximum moisture content that they want to see, but they do have a lower end as well. They also don't want the barley too dry. If it's too dry, it tends to shatter and it tends to break apart more easily. So they're looking for that optimal range. Certainly in a year like this year, there was no risk of having too dry barley. I'm sure anybody who had malting barley here probably had to dry it. And we'll talk about drying in a couple of minutes. But certainly 13.5% moisture is the limit. And there are reasons for that. Damp, tough grain doesn't process well. It's heavy. It doesn't keep and store, of course. That's one of the big things. And as I mentioned, barley can be too dry in some years, but that's really typically not our problem in Western Canada. The last bullet point on here is just to say that in years when moisture is high, like this year, barley should be at a minimum aerated. You have to be very careful about heating in your bins. And generally speaking this year, most malting barley would have had to be dried, depending on where you were located, not everywhere. But there was a lot of drying going on this year. And of course, the rule with drying is low and slow. You don't want to put too much heat on it. I don't have the temperatures handy, but if you're interested in knowing more about drying temperatures and what are safe, come see me afterward and we can talk about that. So that's moisture. Protein. As I mentioned, we just talked a lot about that. Generally speaking, the North American malting industry is going to be looking for 10 to 12% protein out of their malting barley. However, as I said, if you look at a grain company, they're going to be willing to accept higher protein levels because generally China is looking for somewhere in that 11.5 to 13% range on their contracts. So depending on the year, a grain company, you might get a grain company accepting up to 14% protein in malt barley, but certainly 13.5%. So just a couple of technical points about protein. Why the range? If protein levels are too high, it can cause processing issues. It can cause haziness in beer. It can cause slower water uptake. A big thing with higher protein levels is that there's less starch in the barley and therefore tend to be less extract. Brewers want extract, which is sugar that makes alcohol. So it's pretty simple math. Higher the protein, lower the starch, potentially less sugar. But the flip side of that is that the brewers need those enzymes. The maltsters and the brewers need those enzymes to break down the starches and to convert those starches to sugars. So they got to find the sweet spot. And depending on their brewing style, whether an adjunct or craft brewer, they're going to want higher or lower levels of protein. Germination. Germination is obviously a critical spec for the malting and brewing companies. Minimum 95% is the standard. All export contracts for malting barley from Canada are sold with a minimum 95% germination spec. So that's based on a 3-day 4 ml test, and sometimes the export specs are based on a 5-day test, which can change things a little bit, but the point is that they're going to be looking for a minimum 95% germination from you. So this is an important, one of the most important characteristics. Without meeting that spec, you're likely not going to get selected for malting barley. And obviously germination is important because the barley has to germinate during the malting process. It starts to grow during steep. When you put it in the germination tank then for 4 days, you want the maximum amount of those barley kernels actually growing and modifying. So they want a minimum of 95%. Typically what we would see in any given year would be a range of germination on selected samples from maybe 94 to 100. We often see 100% germination or 98 or 99. This year, though, with a lot of the pre-harvest sprouting, we've had a little bit of some challenges with malting barley germination. Okay, what's next here? Plumpness. Typically, the spec on plump is going to be minimum 80%. So plumpness, generally speaking, what the malting companies are looking for is uniformity and plump kernels. They like the plumpness because it tends to have higher extract levels, and they like the uniformity for processing. Because if you have thin kernels, it can uptake water more quickly, so you have uneven uptake of water, which leads to uneven modification and processing, which you don't want. You want to have nice friability and a final nice unified modification in the malt. So generally speaking, 80% is going to be the minimum plump requirement, which is help me out, Rory, is it a 664 or for plump? I think it's the 664 sieve is at 80%. Okay, varietal purity. Generally speaking, we recommend that producers use certified seed when they're growing malting barley. Obviously, you don't have to do that every year, but the malt is sold with a varietal purity minimum of 98%. So not that gets tested very often, but the grain companies and the malting companies in particular are looking for varietal purity. The reason varietal purity is important is that every malting barley variety processes differently. I mentioned before, Copeland Metcalf tends to be a higher enzyme variety, which means that it modifies more quickly than, say, Copeland would. So if you have different varieties in the malt plant at the same time, you're going to have an uneven product at the end. So malting companies really want varietal purity. Dawn. In this part of the world, fusarium is a pretty big issue, and certainly we've had a couple of good years here, but I think we all know that it's coming back at some point here soon. So managing your fusarium is extremely important. Typically, the DAWN spec is 0.5 ppm max. One of the things, this is a very big issue for the domestic maltsters and the export market, is one of the number one questions we get from our export customers is, how bad is the fusarium in any given year? What are the DAWN levels? The official spec by the Chinese government is actually 1 ppm, but typically the Chinese companies want 0.5 ppm. Hopefully they won't lower that 0.5 ppm spec, but typically that's what we're working with right now. So fusarium is tough to manage, I know. There's some good tools and better tools these days for managing, and increasingly we have a better understanding of how to manage fusarium. So if you're having that challenge, you should certainly talk to an agronomist or a chemical rep and see what your options are. Chitted kernels, pre-harvest sprouting. This was a big issue this year. We haven't seen a year like this for quite a while with so much pre-harvest sprouting and chitting, and it was so random. I mean, people were harvesting their barley, they thought it was dry, they didn't see any chit in it, and they would submit a sample and it would come back with 3 or 4% chit. They didn't know how that happened. So whether it was just humidity overnight, very unusual year, but certainly pre-harvest sprouting, the issue with it is that it potentially reduces the germination energy in the barley and can shorten the lifespan of that germination energy. So we test, people look for pre-harvest sprouting, but the other test that's done is the RVA, the rapid viscoanalysis test. That is a predictor. It's kind of like the falling number test for milling wheat, but in the case of barley, it's really a predictor of the lifespan or viability of that germination energy. So in a year like this year, we're getting RVA readings of 10, 20, 30, whereas normally we'd want it above 100. So when you get 10, 20, 30 RVAs, the shelf life of that barley, it can be as short as 3 or 4 months. So the message to the processors when they see a low RVA is process that malting barley as fast as possible. You could have a very low RVA and still have 100% germination after harvest, but once that barley gets exported and it's sitting in a port in Qingdao or Dalian or somewhere in China when it's 100 degrees in the summer, it's going to lose its germ pretty quickly if the RVA value is low and if it's suffered pre-harvest sprouting. Heated kernels, quite simply, heated kernels don't germinate. So they can also create other problems, but there's really zero tolerance for heated kernels. If a malting or grain company see heated kernels in your sample, it'll probably be rejected. Staining. Staining in and of itself isn't the end of the world. It can certainly cause tends to cause darker color beer. The problem with staining is that it is an indication to malting companies and grain companies that there's been some fungus potentially, that there could be mycoflora on the barley. So they're very careful about the fungal load, as that can have an impact on processing, germination energy. It can also cause gushing in the beer. We've seen that. Some of you may remember 2016. It was a big fusarium year. And I remember in about February of 2017 getting a phone call from one of Canada's largest brewers and asking me what the heck happened to the 2016 barley crop. And the answer was that it got rained on during the growing season, and there was a lot of fusarium. But they were having customers phoning them and saying, I just opened I won't say which beer, and it exploded all over me. And that's literally what happens. You open the beer, and beer shoots out. It's crazy. And that's the result, that can be the result of, we're actually not entirely sure what it's a result of, but generally it's associated with fungus and potentially DAWN or fusarium levels. And then just generally speaking, damaged kernels. Be careful when you're handling your barley, when you're harvesting it, when you're handling it. Peeled and broken is a very big issue for the malting and brewing industry, both on the barley and the malt. On the malting side, damaged kernels tend to absorb water more quickly than the other kernels. So again, you have this uneven processing and uneven modification potentially. So they're looking at a maximum of 2% peeled and broken kernels on your malt barley. So obviously, the less damaged kernels you have, the better, and increases your chance for selection. There are a number of other things that I didn't mention today that may impact selection of your malting barley, including things like ergot. We don't see much ergot anymore, but we do see it sometimes. And there are ways of managing all of these things. Ergot, for example, if you're seeing this problem, talk to an agronomist or talk to a specialist, because there are ways of managing fusarium and ergot. Mold and mildew is an issue. I've already talked about a little bit. Frost, smut, black point. These can all lead to rejection of malting barley. When it comes to submitting a sample, make sure you have a representative sample from each of your bins. Make sure you have a good airtight, weather-tight envelope that you're putting your sample in to submit, so that it doesn't get damaged or doesn't get water in there, because that can happen. So again, make sure that you are submitting a representative sample from each bin, and monitor your bins. In a year like this, you really got to monitor your bins to make sure they're not being heated. They need to be on air. They might need to be dried. You might need to take the grain out of the bin, as annoying as that is, if there's any risk of heating. You need to get in there and check it, or get in the top, see if it's spongy or wet or soft, because that will pretty much guarantee. And there's $1.50 a bushel spread between malt barley and feed barley prices. If you've got malt barley, you don't want to lose that $1.50. It's the difference between making money and losing money. Although actually, I think the spread's a little narrower than that right now, but in Manitoba. Okay, I just have a couple of final. So that's really the selection criteria. So those are the main things that the selectors are going to be looking for. They're going to be looking for your protein range, your germination energy, plumpness. Those are the three of the major criteria they're going to be checking, and then they're also going to be looking for disease and other issues with your barley. So I just want to take a couple of minutes now to talk about maybe a little bit about the actual varieties, as we're sort of at a crossroads in the industry right now in Canada. We've been relying very heavily on two malting barley varieties for the last 20 years, Metcalfe and Copeland. And now we've got Synergy and some newer varieties coming along that are really promising. So I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about that. First of all, this is barley production over the last 10 years. This is just all Canada. You can see that we had a pretty good crop this year. Over 10 million tons is the estimate by Stats Canada. So that's the biggest crop since 2008. So that's positive. Yields, better than expected yields, partly driving this, but another increase in seeded area this year drove the increase in barley production. This is a breakout of some of the major varieties that we're growing in Western Canada. They're not all listed here, just some of the key ones. And because I just want to paint the picture here, so you can see Metcalfe and Copeland. Those are the two big ones in blue and green, and we can see Copeland. Upwards of 45, up above 45% of area in the last few years, so really the dominant variety. But one of the big stories here is the decline in Metcalfe. Metcalfe was the dominant variety right from 2002 through to 2015, when it lost its crown to Copeland. But you can see now there's been a precipitous decline in Metcalfe seeded area in Western Canada, and it's quite simple. For you as producers, it doesn't have the same yields. It's susceptible to disease. The international and domestic market they still like Copeland. It's a great variety. They would take it. But you as producers don't want to grow it anymore, and it's no surprise, and I'm glad you don't, because we have new varieties like Synergy, which is now, you can see, pretty remarkable increase, up to almost 20% of seeded area this year. So there's a great variety, and there's a couple of new ones coming along on the bottom there that I've indicated. AAC Connect, which was developed here in Brandon, and CDC Bow, which was developed at the Crop Development Center in Saskatoon. So they have about 2% of seeded area each, so in this coming year they'll be commercially available for the first time. So we have a whole new suite of varieties, and I'll just touch on a couple of the other ones here. So this is the whole list of seeded. This shows you the percentage of seeded area by malting barley variety of total malt barley area. So when you look on the far right, that's 2019. So there you've got Copeland, followed by Metcalfe, and there's Synergy at 19%. And then we go way down then to Legacy, 6-row variety, still being grown primarily for barley tea in Japan. And then here are these two new varieties, AAC Connect and CDC Bow. Newdale, which you'll recognize as a variety that's been around for quite a long time, continues to be grown in certain areas and continues to be purchased by Canada Malting to a certain extent. Celebration, 6-row variety, it's still on our recommended list. Malt Europe in Manitoba is still buying some Celebration, so if that's a variety that you've used, you can continue to grow it this year. Bentley is declining. And then just jump down, Platinum Star is a closed-loop variety with Prairie Malt and Sapporo beer, but just want to draw your attention to CDC Fraser. So this is another one of the new varieties in the suite, I would say, of very promising Canadian malting barley varieties that's an up-and-comer. The interesting thing about these varieties, AAC Connect, CDC Bow, and CDC Fraser, is they all have significantly improved yields, standability, and disease packages, and they also meet the malting barley quality criteria that malting and brewing companies are looking for. Now, each of those varieties is a little bit different. AAC Connect is a sort of a mid-range protein and enzyme barley, whereas Bow is a little bit higher, and Fraser is almost like Metcalfe. It's a very high protein, high enzyme barley that's really suited for the macro adjunct brewing industry. So, and in addition, there are some newer varieties like Low, CDC Copper, and CDC Churchill, and AAC Goldman. These are all newer varieties that are under commercial development as well that you'll see on our recommended list. And if you're interested in testing any of these varieties, you can contact the seed company. AAC Connect is Cantera Seeds, CDC Bow and CDC Fraser, and Low are Secan. And so if you're interested, I would certainly encourage you as producers to try these new varieties. So there it is. That's the recommended list for 2021. I have copies of the recommended list here. If you're interested in it, you can come down and get it. You'll see that the top 5 varieties on the list are still Copeland, Metcalfe, Synergy, and then the 2 new ones, Bow and Connect. Again, a number of the other varieties continue to be in demand, like Newdale can still be contracted with Canada Malting, Platinum Star, Bentley, and then we have these new ones, as I mentioned, Fraser, Low, Copper, and Churchill, which are up-and-comers. So feel free to come afterward and get a copy of the recommended list. The other thing I brought along today was the Canadian Grain Commission's 2019 Quality of Western Canadian Malting Barley. So this is hot off the press. I've got about half a dozen copies here if you're interested. It's a great reference document and tells you a lot about the quality of this year's crop. And lastly, I do have a one-pager here. I do have a one-pager here with the description to the quality parameters that I talked about today: moisture, germination, protein. It gives you the range that the selectors are looking for and a description of why it's important. So please feel free to come up and pick up copies of the recommended list, the target quality parameters, and I do have a few copies of the Western Canadian quality of Western Canadian malting barley from this year. So with that, I will finish my comments, and already got somebody interested there. Sure. So the question is, I think we're really talking about varieties and what, we've had these two varieties, Copeland and Metcalf, that have been so successful for so long. And then everybody knows the Meredith story. And so we feel like we're sort of a repeat of the Meredith situation where you have a new variety, very promising yields in Synergy, and then somebody says, no, we don't want it anymore. But what I will say about Synergy is that, first of all, there's only one company that has decided not to take it. That's Canada Malting. And Canada Malting has, I would say since the beginning, in their defense, have always been quite honest that Synergy didn't really quite fit their portfolio of customers. And I talked before about the different marketplaces and customers, and each company, malting company, has their own portfolio of customers. So Synergy is not working for Canada Malting, but I am surprised to hear you say that the grain companies are saying don't grow it. I haven't heard that personally. I mean, I'd be interested to talk to you afterward to find out who said that. I was just talking yesterday I've spoken to Viterra, Cargill, and Richardson's over the past week. As far as I know, none of those companies are telling farmers not to grow Synergy. So there really is just the one malting company, Canada Malting. Malt Europe and Manitoba has never used Synergy, but the other two, RAR and Prairie, continue to use Synergy. The export market, China, will sell more Synergy this year to China again than we did last year, and we probably will sell more again next year to China. So I think that there's still good market opportunities for Synergy in this coming year, and it's a good malting variety. It's too bad that it didn't work for Canada Malting, but I think for the coming year at least there'll still be good market opportunities. So I would encourage, if you were planning to grow Synergy, I wouldn't tell you not to. I don't think you should not grow it. I think you should continue. There'll be a marketplace for it. If it's worked for you, then that's great. But if you want to come see me afterward and we can talk a little bit more about it, but because I know this is a very, producers are really liking Synergy in many areas of Western Canada. It's worked out for them very well. So hopefully it'll continue to be an important variety in the mix in Western Canada. But just to conclude, I should say that we have been working very hard as an industry over the past 2 years to promote these new varieties so that to our end-use customers, because that's what we have to do. So, for example, at the CMBTC, we've been coordinating production trials in China. We did Synergy originally. Now they're buying Synergy in China. We did Bowen Connect over the last 2 years. So now the Chinese companies are getting familiar with these new varieties. We're working on doing Fraser. So, and the domestic malting industry is always testing these varieties as well. So I think, keep an eye on, for future years, keep an eye on some of these new ones, like I said, like Connect and Bow and Fraser as well. They're looking really good.
Any other questions? Anybody with, Fred?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Fred. That's a great point. One of the things we do at the CMBTC is we put on courses for people interested in learning about malting and brewing. And one of the things we started this year for the first time was a producer. It's called the Malt Academy. And we started producer Malt Academy courses. We did the first two in this fall, one here in Manitoba for Manitoba producers, and we did one in Saskatoon for producers in Saskatchewan. And then we're doing one in a couple of weeks in Alberta. So I think this will be an annual thing. So we're hoping that probably next, Kate, when are we thinking about this? Next November or December, we'll do the next Malt Academy. So as producers, if you're interested, we held it in Winnipeg at our center in downtown Winnipeg, because then we have access to our malt plant and brewery. But anybody is welcome from the industry in Manitoba to come on these courses. There's no charge or a small, very limited charge, if there is any. And you spend a day and a half or 2 days at the CMBTC learning about malting barley, how to grow it, and the importance of different quality criteria, the marketplace, etc. So thanks for the suggestion, Fred. If you want to learn more about the CMBTC's Malt Academy, keep an eye on our website or the Manitoba Wheat and Barley Growers. Keep an eye out for next year's session, which should be, as I said, probably in November, sometime in November or early December.
Any other questions?
Come down and get your copies of things if anyone's interested here, or I'll take them with me to the back. I'm not sure.
Peter, I've got a question for you. In a number of your slides, you've identified that between the craft breweries and the mainline brewing companies and the malt houses that they're looking for different qualities in the malt. Could you explain why, I guess in particular, the craft breweries are requiring a different quality of malt barley?
So as I was mentioning before, a lot of it is about the quality specs that are associated with the protein. And because the craft breweries are not using any adjunct, so they're not using any corn or rice to supplement the sugar, they're using 100% barley malt. They tend to want less of some of these components, like protein in particular, enzymes and FAN, because there's too much in Canadian barley of those components. Our barley tends to have high enzyme levels and high free amino nitrogen, which feeds the yeast. And what can actually happen is if the levels are too high, it can cause problems for craft brewers in their processing. It can create haziness in the beer. If you have too much free amino nitrogen, it can actually choke off the yeast. So they want these levels to be lower. So that's why we're seeing this differentiated marketplace with the craft. And, 10 years ago, it wasn't so important because the craft was such a small component of use. But now, with 35 to 40% of North American malt consumption in the craft industry, that's a whole segment. And our breeding programs now are actually tailoring new varieties to the craft industry. And the first new varieties that really suit the craft industry in Western Canada are Lowe, L-O-W-E, and CDC Churchill, which are on the recommended list. These are low protein, low enzyme, and potentially low FAN varieties that can be used by the craft brewing sector.
Is there any other questions? If not, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Peter for his very informative session on the malt barley industry, and thank you on behalf of Manitoba Wheat and Barley Growers.
Thank you.